Coming up on today's episode of the Salesman podcast.
In the trenches mentorship, the friendships you build at that level, even if the person is not an absolute expert at the task at hand, is going to be a lot better than having, the sales consultant come in and give a one-day workshop.
Hello, Sales Nation. I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman podcast, and welcome to today's episode. On today's show, we have Burt, and we're diving not into the usual sales tips, tricks, hacks, techniques. We're diving into how to learn them faster. We're talking about mentorship. We're talking about live events for salespeople very specifically, and I hint at something that I'm perhaps planning in the background that you'll hear about in the not too distant future. You can find out more about Connor over at Lessonly, which is lesson.ly. Just type that into your browser and it'll all become apparent. And with all that said, without further ado, let's jump into today's episode. Hi Connor, and welcome to the Salesman podcast.
Hey, thanks Will. Good to be here.
You're more than welcome, sir. So today I want to dive into we can talk about sales, training, techniques, all that stuff as well, but I want to dive into the process of learning to become better at sales, because I think that is something that is missed. I know it's missed in my experience by a lot of sales trainers. They might understand the techniques and the tips and the tools, but how they've put it across in the past has not been the best way, in my experience. I've got some thoughts on this as well, but let's start with the most basic kind of high-level question. Is there a one best way to learn how to sell, and I guess to learn how to do anything, or is it different for every single person listening?
Yeah, great question. I'd say, Will, my answer to that would be definitely different. It depends on what you're selling, who you're selling to, why you're selling. Before we typically even get into training with our reps, I think as a manager or even as an individual contributor, it's always good to understand where is this motivation coming from first, because that's going to dictate a lot of times how we think about training, how we think about, training and motivation kind of go hand in hand. I'd say definitely different across the board. What I would say on the flip side of that is it always helps to have a framework. I'm sure in your background in sales, no two situations are ever perfectly alike, but it does help to have a framework in terms of how to think about the sales process, and whether that's something like the challenger sale, spin selling, or the myriad of other options you have out there today. My advice to younger teams is always just pick one, use it, own it, and kind of riff from the framework, but not necessarily become robotic about it.
So we know, I assume most of the people now, if they've been listening for a while, will know a lot of the sales frameworks, the sales processes, and all in all, they work similar methods depending on how they're pitched and marketed. And that seems to be the biggest differentiator between most of them. But is there a framework to learn how to sell through one of those processes, if that makes sense? In that, are we best to cram it all and learn it verbatim and then just go out and experience it? Is that the best way to learn how to sell using one of these processes? Or should we start perhaps with the motivation layer and then work on top of that, and then at the end you can talk about perhaps the more high level stuff? Is there a best way to go about learning of sales, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And I tend to err on the side of experience first and learn through that. So, what I always think about is the first sales job is so important. I know you have a lot of millennial B2B folks listening to this podcast. I would say before you dive too far into frameworks and understanding what they mean and how to learn them, the best way to learn is going to be to get out there. If I think about my experience, I had no idea what sales was, what a framework was, or how to learn it. And my first sales job, I tried to start a company that sold composting services. And what that meant is I would go door to door here in Indianapolis, Indiana, not a very environmentally friendly city, to say the least. And I would knock on people's doors and say, hey, do you know what composting is? I'm selling a service. I'll pick up your compost, your food waste once a week, pay me $25. And so to answer your question directly, my experience has been the way you learn is to get out there first, and then kind of backtrack that into the frameworks that are going to help you. And for the younger listeners, I think it always helps to have that kind of marquee, really tough sales job to start. For me, it was going to door to door selling compost. Maybe it's selling knives at an early age. Getting those experiences where you're going to cut your teeth and realize, man, this could be the hardest job I ever have. And from there, it gets easier, and the learning gets easier as you go.
And is this something that you see commonly with salespeople? And I'll give you an example of myself. My first ever cold call was my first job, first day, first medical device job, with my sales manager. Literally, I sat at a desk. He was literally sat over there next to me, and he just gave me my laptop, phone, and said, "Oh, these are your best accounts. Now go and book some meetings with them." And they were all friendly accounts. So it was a warmish call, really, but in my mind,
Sure.
it was a cold call. And and I'm sat there thinking, oh God. So I'm over preparing for each one of these calls. I'm writing loads of notes. And of course, he's just sat there making sure that I physically do call and I don't wuss out. and I know this. And he's like kind of looking over his shoulder at me. And he's a really good guy. So I wasn't feeling threatened or anything like that, but I was anxious about it. And then, of course, you do it, and then it's not a big deal. And then you're over cold calling for the majority once you've done that enough times.
Yeah.
Whereas one of the most common emails I get from the listeners is, how do I get over cold calling? And my answer is always, and this is what I want to get your insights on, because my answer is always just go and do it. But is it as simple as that?
Yeah, I honestly, I'm in your camp. But I do think there's some ways you can, kind of inch up to that courage and the point where you actually hop on that first call. To be honest, for us, what we've done and seen successful is inching up through kind of like mentoring or practice. It sounds simple, but before you get on that first call, just run through it with a colleague. Doesn't have to be a manager, doesn't have to be someone higher in the organization, especially when you're new. Just grab someone and say, hey, can we role play this real quick? And remind yourself that 95% of the time you're going to be leaving a voicemail. That's the reality of cold calling. So between those two things, just have a little bit of practice. You don't have to overthink it, but sit with a colleague, practice it before you do it a couple times. And that'll never stop, right? Whether you're closing deals or trying to source them through a cold call, practice is often one of the greatest ways to learn. But ultimately, I think to muster up that courage, it does take that initial work with a colleague or a manager to feel comfortable. And then the realization that 95% of the time, I'm just going to be talking to a voicemail box, which is a different skill, but often a little bit less intimidating for younger reps in terms of what I've seen.
Let's stop on this idea of mentorship and role plays and this kind of thing for a minute, because I don't know how wide your knowledge is with other companies in the tech sector and that as well, but how widely utilized is something that is essentially free, which is mentoring, versus bringing someone in, paying them tens of thousands of dollars. They give a big rah-rah speech, perhaps there's a follow-up at some point as well as this stereotypical sales trainer. Which is more useful? And obviously a leading loaded question here, but which is probably more useful and which has the best ROI?
Yeah. Honestly, I'd say there's probably a stage of, it depends on the stage of company, but my experience has been in the trenches mentorship, the friendships you build at that level, even if the person is not an absolute expert at the task at hand, is going to be a lot better than having, the sales consultant come in and give a one-day workshop, because they're going to leave, like you say, and the things that they teach you, there might be 2 to 3 things you take away that you incorporate into your day. But at the end of that workshop, you got to get back to work, and having someone you can talk to about it regularly, I think, is more important. And some people might say, if it's not an expert, it's the blind leading the blind. But I think you end up learning from each other. I mean, the mentoring relationships I've been in, I like to think being a mentor, I often learn just as much from the mentee and vice versa. And so you get this kind of symbiotic relationship. So I'm all in the camp of going that route before bringing in, formal sales training. Not saying there's not a place for it, but specifically kind of consultants who come in and do these workshops, I think comes later. Mentoring's got to be the foundation.
Definitely. I massively agree with that. And for the salesperson listening now, for someone to come and approach you, I guess as a on the ground salesperson, and they've listened to this show and they want mentoring through someone perhaps more senior in the company, what would be the best, or what advice would you give them, and how would you like them to approach you to say, hey, I feel like this would be really beneficial. It's going to cut down some of my selling time perhaps in the short term. But obviously there's an ROI there. How would you like someone to approach you to ask for permission to have this mentoring?
It's a great question. I think my advice to people looking for a mentor would be start internally. I think that's probably easier, to be honest, because there's this vested interest. If you're in the right culture and the right sales team, there should be some willingness to bring each other up together. So I would. If your company doesn't already offer a mentoring structured program, I'd ask your colleagues first. Pick the guy who is the rock star, or even you can tell just good at their craft. Ask them first. I think then when you think about making that ask, if you do go outside of the company, which also can be beneficial, I think it's just really good to set clear expectations of what you're after. And so if somebody were coming to me and asking for advice, I think it's hard to just do it in a one-time coffee meeting. I think there's value in those, but at the end of the day, if you really want to mentor, it's best to keep a continuing relationship. And if it were me, I'd use similar to a sales tactic, right? I'm going to reach out to me, first through a network of people that I already know. So I'm going to try and get to myself if I'm asking for mentorship through one of my colleagues first. And ideally, you can get a note from somebody who knows me well, who respects me, or I respect them rather. And it says, hey, let's say Will's reaching out to ask me for mentorship. It says, hey, there's this guy, Will. He really wants to be great at his job. He's looking for a once-a-month commitment to talk for 30 minutes about what he's seeing in sales and try and learn from you. And I think if you approach it that way, kind of going the route of finding a network connection, you're going to have a lot more luck than just reaching out cold.
Mm-hmm. And this leads us very nicely to a point here that I guess some people will differ in their opinions on. And I'm thinking the most successful people will take full responsibility for this themselves personally. But whose responsibility is it for your sales training and for your career development as a salesperson? Is it for you, the individual, to be, I guess, you get your commissions, you reinvest them back into yourself through books, online courses, or whatever it is? Or is it down to the company and solely down to the company to clearly you close more deals, you make them more money, and so there's an ROI for them as well? Who should be footing the bill for all this?
Yeah, I come from the mindset of, I'll get to footing the bill. I actually think that's probably less important. I think what's more important is the concept of really just owning your own development. We have a board member, Scott Dorsey, in Indianapolis. It's the greatest software company to ever come through our city. Sold to Salesforce for $2.5 billion. And, he saw the company from 0 to $2.5 billion. And one of his biggest kind of keys to growth was that the sales organization in particular owned their own development. Of course, they brought in resources later in stages, but at the end of the day, it was up to the individual to own the opportunity to get better every day. And so if you do that, I think it's easy for a company to reimburse you for those things. If I can see that one of our sales reps, let's say it's Aaron, is actively buying books, actively listening to podcasts like yours that I know you don't necessarily have to pay for, actively trying to get better. When she comes to me and makes the ask of, hey, Will from the Salesman podcast is opening up this live event. I'd really like to go. I think I can learn something. I'm going to be a lot more apt to say yes to that on a case-by-case basis as a manager, because I've watched and seen Erin go through the day-to-day grind of trying to get better and owning her development. So I think it starts with owning it, and then the kind of reimbursement and payment, I think, comes naturally after that when you're in the right environment.
Nice. I don't think anyone's ever said it in that way before, and I don't think I've read loads of sales books, of course, and then even more since doing the podcast, but I don't think I've ever asked or even thought about asking management to reimburse anything. But I guess if you can say, well, hey, look, I read this book, 2 months down the line, maybe a book is too small of a nominal fee, or I went to this event and I've closed 110% of targets since. I'd love it for you to pay for that one so I can go to the next one or whatever. I think that's probably something that is underutilized, perhaps. I mean, how many of your team have come to you and said things similar?
Oh, absolutely. It happens all the time.
Good.
It definitely happens at all layers as well. I mean, we've got a couple of folks in sales management who have said, hey, I want to sharpen up X, Y, or Z. This looks great. So they do it. I have, give you a tangible example. We have an SDR team. They love the product we use that runs their day called Sales Loft. And they came and said, hey, I'd love to go to their user conference. I really want to learn more about the products and best practices, what other companies are doing. We were happy to do that. And I think the third leg of that, once you own your development, ask for, things once you've done that. The third piece of that, and the way I think we ask our reps to think about it, is this isn't just for you, this is for the rest of the team, right? So when I send a rep out to Sales Loft to go learn best practices of their product and how to build a great cadence, ideally they're coming back into the team and they're bringing those insights. It's not going to be an essay, right? But it's going to be 3 to 5 actionable things that they can walk away with, that the rest of the team can benefit from. And you feel their energy, right? When they come back from that conference, they're fired up, they're ready to go. And so if you're thinking about going to your management and asking for these things, certainly make it about owning your development, getting better, hitting quota at 150% versus 110, but also think about how that loops back into the team and what you can bring back to the team after going to some of these more structured conferences, environments, live events, etc.
Mm-hmm. And just a slightly selfish question here. I mentioned it when we were setting up and before we clicked record. The audience are asking me to put on some kind of event. Do you feel, and because I've never really been to a live sales event before of any magnitude really, and so I'm intrigued here. And it's more of a stereotypically American thing than a UK thing. And I wouldn't want to be, it would be setting it up in the UK rather than in the US. I wouldn't want to be traveling all the time at first if we were to do something. And I know I'm going to get loads of emails now that I've mentioned it on the show. But do you see value in live events like this for salespeople? Is there opportunity here to make a real difference with an in-person event?
I certainly think so. I think it can be tricky with sales. I've been a sales professional my whole career, and I'm saying this, but you get a bunch of salesmen and women in the same room. And it can get not uncomfortable, but for certain types of folks, it's not their favorite environment. And so it can quickly spin into a, overly competitive, everybody wants to talk about themselves type of environment. And so I guess that would be the con of it. The pro of it, I think, the ones that I've seen and been to are when they're smaller, more intimate, and you get time to really build relationships either with leaders that you can kind of talk through challenges together, and or at the sales rep level, same kind of thing. Tell me about what you're selling. What challenges are you seeing? And when you have the time and the space, and it's not these monster events where there's just some motivational speaker up there giving you an hour of hoorah, that's really where I think you get value out of a conference or a live event. So I err on the side of smaller, intimate, forum style events versus kind of large, blown out, basically entertainment.
Sure. It's an interesting split there, the kind of Tony Robbins versus the small. Actually, I really want to go to Tony Robbins' event as well. But,
I do too. Yes, I shouldn't say that.
Yeah,
100%
versus the perhaps breakout sessions event that exists as well. Okay, and I want to go back just to wrap up this part of the show, Connor. I want to go back to something you said right at the beginning, and that is that underlying all of this is perhaps, and perhaps is more important than sales skills, even to a certain extent, is the level of motivation that that individual has.
Yeah.
How do we, if possible, how do we train our motivation? Is that a tangible thing that we can move the needle of?
Yeah, that's a tough one. If I knew the golden ticket to that one, I'd be in good shape. So I'll tell you, I don't know the right answer. I'll tell you what I think. I think it starts with reflection. Honestly, if you look at a sales career, you have, at least in the United States, when I look at this, I remember thinking as going through university, I'm sure you were the same as a chemistry major. I never thought I'd have a career in sales. But when you look at statistics, I saw one from the Harvard Business Review not too long ago. Almost 50% of college graduates end up in some capacity working in a sales role as one of their first jobs. Mm-hmm. And so I think we've got to reframe what a profession in sales really is. And then underlying that, have some self-reflection to understand why you're getting into it. So some folks, it's compensation, right? There's huge upside in a sales career, specifically in B2B SaaS. There's great margins on your product. Companies can afford to invest in sales because the business and the unit economics work out really great. So if you're thinking about that and that's a motivator, head for B2B SaaS because there's a great opportunity. But on the flip side of that, there's also folks that love to sell for different reasons. And maybe that's it provides flexibility in other parts of your life. Maybe you're motivated by having the time and the energy to go spend doing hobbies like maybe you like to fly fish, maybe you like the outdoors, maybe you love spending time with your family. I mean, you got to figure out what those things are before you can really start to, quote unquote, train the motivation. So I think it really starts with self-reflection, and it's going to change over time, but you got to sit there and you got to think about it. You got to really ponder it, and you got to talk to people about it because every individual is different. They get into it for a different reason. And once you have those written down, we basically have everyone go through a vision statement, and part of the vision statement is just, what gets you up in the morning? Why are you coming to work every day? Why are you investing in a sales career? And we make individuals think about that because if you don't have an answer to that, it's going to be really hard to try and get more motivated and better. It's a long answer to your question. I don't know if I have the answer, but I think it starts with self-reflection. From there, I'd certainly think there's things you can do to kind of pump up the motivation. But if you don't know where it starts, it's going to be hard.
Amazing. I enjoy that. And I think, again, and tell me if you agree with this, I'm going to make a bold statement that if you don't know your motivation, as you just described, and you haven't got a vision statement or some other tool to narrow it down and to remind yourself of it, because that's something I forget about quite often of why are you putting in the hours and the effort and the hustle and the grind of things. It becomes a drag until you remind yourself, and then it becomes feasible and it becomes reasonable. But a bold statement is that knowing your motivation is probably a bigger needle mover than any sales process, than any methodology, than any software tool. Is that something that you'd agree with as well? That once you've got that motivation, the amount of hustle that you can put out, that output, is probably going to outweigh any book that you can read.
Heck yeah. Absolutely. I mean, a sales book is not a sales methodology, unless you're just a total sales geek, is not going to fire you up unless you're working towards something. 100% agree.
Good man. Okay, I've got a couple of questions that I run through with everyone that comes on the show. First one, and I'll just say you can be as long or as short with these as you like. I keep calling them Quickfire Questions, and then they go on for another 20 minutes. So, open here, whether you get a quick answer or short answer. But the first one, when are you more productive, in the morning or in the evenings?
Morning.
And what time do you get up?
I'm up around 6:30. Sometimes a little earlier if I'm doing I tend to like spontaneity, so I'm not a big, every day looks the exact same, but I try to get up 6:30, start my day with, best days it's a workout. Second best days, it's a cup of coffee and some time to browse through news, current events, things like that.
Nice. So would you say that makes up the first 60 minutes of your morning?
I'd say about 30-ish is that. And definitely if I'm getting in the fitness side. The other things that I believe in all good days start with a great breakfast. So I tend to take my time also in that first 60 minutes getting in some nutritious brain food to get the day going.
Good man. Okay, next one. What is, in dollar size if possible, the biggest deal that you've ever closed?
Dollar size. Wow. Well, I think it'd probably be a little bit different. Our recent round of funding was probably the biggest, and I was a part of it, not the entire part of it, but we just finished a $5 million fundraising round from OpenView Venture Partners out of Boston. For me, that was the biggest deal I've ever been a part of. That'd be my short answer.
Congratulations on that. The next one. What is one book or resource that you'd recommend to the Salesman podcast audience?
Yeah, so non-sales related, I love just people into entrepreneurship, The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. One of my favorite books on entrepreneurship, and it's basically not a business book, which I think everybody needs a little bit of good dose of just other things outside of business. If it is a sales book, I'm big into I'm a Roberge fan. I like the sales acceleration formula.
Nice. We'll link to both of them in the show notes for everyone listening. And last one of these quick ones. Who is the world's greatest salesperson?
Man, I know you sent me this. I didn't think about that one. That is tough.
You're not supposed to tell the audience that I send them pre-interview. Everyone's raving now, listening to this in their cars, going, "Wow, Connor is so quick on his feet to answer these."
You know, I'm gonna go sentimental with this one. I'm gonna say my dad, which nobody on the show is ever gonna meet, but the guy worked with schools on health insurance in the United States, which is probably another topic for you coming from the UK. But I think from him, learned really how to care about the customer. He was essentially in a sales job and you would have never known it. So I'd give props to him.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being so candid with that as well. I appreciate that. And final question, the one that I ask everyone that comes on the show, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
Yeah, my two things here. Get really good at learning how to ask great questions, second level questions that are not always obvious. And that is in a sales context, but that is also with relationships and other things in your life. If you can get really good at asking great questions, that is the first step to becoming a great salesperson. And then along with that, I would say a healthy dose of curiosity, just generate that early. Those two things are two pieces that we see every sales rep that I've ever worked with be really, really strong at.
And final thing, just to follow up on that, give us a practical example of a second level sales question.
Yeah, one of my favorites. So oftentimes we talk to reps about urgency, right? One of the biggest killers of deals isn't always a competitor or somebody else who's potentially going to provide a solution to your prospect, but it's inaction, especially in certain types of software sales. So the status quo, what I'm doing is okay today. So one of my favorite questions is really simple, and it works in any context. It's essentially, we understand the problem and the current state of the prospect, and we ask them simply, if you don't change anything now, what happens? And you just let them go. And ultimately, that in a lot of cases leads to more why questions, but it's the starter to get them thinking about, why do I want to change? Why now? And if I don't, what happens? And is there a compelling event for change? Nice.
I love questions like that. I always describe those questions as the ones where it's perhaps a little battle for about half a second of not to say any more, not to say anything else, and to let them they're kind of formulating, well, how can I get out of this without divulging too much information, even if you've got a good relationship with them. And whoever just holds off for that microsecond longer usually wins the negotiation of information there. So I appreciate that. And Connor, tell us a little bit about Lessonly and also where we can find out more about you as well.
Yeah, you bet. I love LinkedIn. So you can find Lessonly at lesson.ly. We make learning automation software, so work with clients like TripAdvisor, Trunk Club, ultimately, and provide software that helps teams better train and enable their teams, provide them the fundamental information they need to do their best work. So that's kind of our mission as a company. We work with a ton of sales and support teams who really are just looking to invest in employees. Me personally, email me, Connor, CONNER, at lesson.ly, or check me out on LinkedIn if you're curious what I've been up to for the last few years.
Amazing. We'll link to all that in the show notes over at salesman.red. And Connor, thank you for your time today, mate. I enjoyed our conversation, and I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman podcast.
Oh, you bet. Thank you, Will. Appreciate it. Best of luck.
And there we have it. Connor, thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for your time. I appreciate that. If you haven't already, it's well worth checking out Peter Gould's episode, which aired yesterday, where we're talking about the huge benefits to knowing your personal why you personally are selling, and then diving into the why of your product, service, the company you work for, and a whole lot more. You can find out more about that over at salesman.red/184. And with all that said, I'll speak with you all again on tomorrow's episode.